So let's talk through the 10 strongest factions of Warhammer 40k in terms of tournament win rates and what they're using to do well on the tabletop at the moment. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about strong Warhammer 40k armies, and in this video I thought it would be interesting to take a look through some of the armies that seem to be performing best at the moment in current Warhammer 40k. In Warhammer 40k, of course, there's a lot of ways that you could gauge army strength. In general on the channel, I do like to talk through in terms of tournament win percentage. I feel like it's quite a nice rough and ready metric for overall army power, even if it definitely does come with limitations. I feel like it's maybe a bit more applicable to the average player, as opposed to necessarily looking at top event placings and things, which are a bit more relevant to a select few who are looking to top grand tournaments. They more show the absolute potential of a faction when it's both got an awesome list and played by a great player. So as we talk through the armies, I'll also talk about the armies that seem to have been doing best in terms of top placing at tournaments. The stat I'll use for that one is going undefeated over the course of the first 5 games in a tournament, which I think is maybe a little bit more inclusive than just tournament victories, as just looking at those discounts a whole bunch of players that have done similarly well but in enormous great big events. Alongside that, I'll also take a look at more casual win rates, and which armies are getting chosen to play more at grand tournaments as well. A bit of a sentiment as to how the meta's feeling about certain armies. I'll leave the sources for all this linked down in the video description. Best Coast Pairings, Miniheadquarters and Tabletop Herald for collating tournament winners. StatCheck 40k with their interesting breakdowns and tables for past metas. Meta Monday, who does big grand tournaments and generally tends to have the cutting edge data right when it comes out, so I'll be using theirs for their primary win rate. And then Goonhammer's Warhammer 40k Stat Center, which has some good stats on casual games via their own Tabletop Battles app. I'll talk about the slightly more casual win rate numbers from that. Broadly in 40k at the moment, at still rate game balance is not really all that terrible. At least on a casual level, the vast majority of armies can compete with the vast majority of other ones. There maybe are just a few that are just kind of blatantly overpowered in one way or another, and certainly ones that are struggling a bit more. It's still not quite the early days where we were seeing 70% win rates on Eldari though. First up, before we get into the top 10 by win rates, these were the armies that were more ranking in the mid-tier, between win rates of 47% to 49% at grand tournaments. Here we've got Genestealer Cults on 49, Chaos Marines and Tau Empire on 48, and then World Eaters, Eldari and the Emperor's Children all on 47. I say all of these have some interesting stuff to bring to the table. I think that most people wouldn't really argue it that they're vying for the best army in the game at the moment compared with the other scary stuff out there. I feel like a few of them are maybe more worthy of mention than others though in terms of top table performance. The World Eaters have been doing well in a whole load of big tournaments, lots of players going undefeated there, Chaos in general having a good time on the top tables. The Tyranids and the Space Marines both have lower numbers than the mid-tier ones, but again plenty of good players are managing to break into the top tables with them. And Genestealer Cults were right on the borderline for win rates anyway, placing in 11th, and also for the small number of people playing them they do seem to have a disproportionate win percentage. For the armies I'll focus on today though, I will go through the top 10 for win percentage, and in 10th we have Chaos Demons. According to Meta Monday, over the first 4 weeks, they've won 50% of their games, which has dropped a fair bit since pre-update. Previously they were on around about 54 or so that has slid down a bit. The more casual win rates that Goonhammer has puts them at around about the same level on 52, maybe a little bit more comfortably upper mid there. They still seem to be having some good success on the top tables, 7 tournament games with the first 5 going undefeated. They maybe seem to have slipped a bit in terms of the number of people playing them, dropping down to 11th out of the 28 armies. For the Demons, their last balance updates had some small points nerfs to the Shadow Legion good enhancements. Nerdlings went up to 40 points but gained a 5+ invulnerable save, and had a few small changes to the Tzeentch and Khorne detachments, though they don't really feel like they're being quite as critical, given the vast majority of people playing the Shadow Legion or the Incursion. Those 2 detachments still seem to be really well represented. Shadow Legion is the one that you get the deity-specific buffs, some helpful stratagems, and the ability to ally in Chaos Space Marine datasheets, a whole bunch of which can be pretty useful. And the Demon Incursion is the Index Warp Rift one, lots of shenanigans for moving things on and off the board, some very big nasty enhancements for the Greater Demons, perhaps particularly the Great Unclean 1/4+ Feel No Pain, and spooky abilities like being able to 6-inch Deep Strike and charge straight away, both with a stratagem and Greater Demon auras. For the units being put on the tabletop, Be'lakor's often in pride of place. Turning off shooting at greater than 18-inch range is a really big deal. His Shadow aura is good, and he has some alright damage of his own as well. Demons have got plenty of good support units, sticky objectives with Plague Bearers, cheap infiltrate screens with Nurglings, Fleshhounds to jump on and off the boards doing objectives, and Beast of Nurgle for cheap annoying scout threats, so between that lots of good things for board control and objective grabbing. Most of the Greater Demons are really nice as mainline damage dealers. Maybe the Great Unclean one and Rottagus stand out a bit above the rest, just their sheer tankiness is awesome and their damage output isn't as bad as it used to be. Some of the Tzeentch things can be good support, Screamers and Flamers. The Lord of Change can have some alright magical damage. Bloodthirsters and Scarbrand are both good, particularly the Bloodthirster with the Return to Reservist tricks in the Shadow Legion from the enhancement there. And Blood Crushers could be an interesting one to drop close in the Demon Incursion, getting a 6-inch deep strike and charge. Overall, still looks like they're broadly on the upper end of Warhammer 40k. Maybe the Celeste units being a bit overshadowed compared with most. Still feels like they're perhaps paying for the sins of the pre-nerf Legion of Excess. And it looks like the nerfs to the Shadow Legion might have pushed the Demon Incursion just that bit better than it, at least in terms of stats so far. Demon Incursion does seem to have the higher win rate. Next up, and just about clinging on in the top 10, despite having a really quite bad tournament weekend last week, are the Adeptus Custodes. Again, according to Meta Monday, they've got a 50% win rate at Grand Tournaments, which has dropped just a tiny bit since the last update. Again, in Goonhammer, looking like they're doing a little bit better on the casual tables at 52%. I feel like that's maybe not too unusual for Custodes. Big stat check style armies tending to do better in a more casual versus competitive meta. Their tournament victories also seem to go hand in hand with that. Just the 3 runs that I could find, going 5 games undefeated for the first 5, and that is lower than the vast majority of other armies on this list. Though people are still feeling generally fairly positive about putting them on the table. Play them 9th most in grand tournaments out of 28, though I maybe wouldn't be too surprised if that drops down a bit. They didn't really get all that many changes in the last balance update. The Allarus Custodians dropping down to 60 points was helpful enough. They're already fairly good in lines, and overall maybe looks like they're doing similarly well to how they did before in the stats. For the detachments being used, it still remains the Lines of the Emperor that's the most used and most successful. Big +1 to wound things for units fighting in isolation, some nice enhancements and stratagems to scrap in the midboard. The other 2 most popular ones are the Shield Host and Solar Spearhead, both of which are doing alright. Most of the Custodes roster is at least solidly usable at the moment. Wardens plus Blade Champions remain a solid central unit for the battle line, good at fighting for the midboard objectives. Custodian Guard often seen play with Kyria Draxus, turning off shooting and adding her big damage output shooting with the rerolls to the mix. Fast-moving Virtus Praetors, rapid ingressing Venatari, and the Allarus Custodians with their deep strike teleport tricks are all popular enough in a supporting role, as are some of the Shield Captains and Trajan Valoris in the Lines of the Emperor. Then most armies will want some Sisters of Silence to do some grunt work, screen and score, and the Caladius Grav tank can be a good option to provide some big hitting anti-tank fire support. It does feel like for internal balance they're doing a lot better than they used to, at least nice enough to have the majority of datasheets in their codex usable. For their weaknesses, they do generally tend to rely on their big stat lines and 4+ invulnerable saves to get the job done. Maybe slightly fewer clever tricks compared with some armies out there, and games can potentially be a bit swingy depending on whether or not they make all their saves or fail all of them, at least compared with some armies. They might not be enjoying things like Death Guard and the Imperial and Chaos Knights being in such big ascendancy. They've certainly got some terrifically strong rivals for just outright power damage dealer armies in the game right now. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. They have one option for easy to store and transport magnetic carry cases, all made by Sam based in West Virginia in the USA. They're in the last 24 hours or so of their Independence Day sale. Apparently that ends on the 9th, and they have discounts of around about 25% off. Tabletop Stronghold basically make magnetic carry cases. The idea is that you attach magnets to the base of your miniatures so they can all line up nicely and be held in place during transit, and you can fit lots of miniatures safely in a really tight space due to not needing foam and things. Tabletop Stronghold's solution to that is to make these cases out of MDF, the big sturdy boxes that are kind of notably hard to break or damage, and then within those boxes you have steel trays that can slide in at different levels to transport miniatures of various different heights. On the front there's a clear acrylic sheet, which means that you can see your miniatures and nicely painted handiwork as you transport it about a bit. Broadly speaking, reviews that I've seen both down in the YouTube comments and on Reddit and places have generally been very positive for people who pick them up. I would genuinely recommend them myself. If you want to take a look over their range, then there'll be links down in the video description, and I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video if you'd like to see a little bit more about their specific models. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, moving onwards and upwards, we've got the Blood Angels. They're also on 50% as well, having risen up a fair bit after the big buffs they got. They were previously on around about 45 or 46%. And seem to be doing pretty similar for the slightly more casual game meta from Goonhammer. Despite gaining a whole bunch of big points cuts and some very efficient units, it really doesn't seem to have amounted to crazy amounts on the top tables. For the Blood Angels at the moment though, only having 3 players that have gone 5 games undefeated as best I could tell. Like the Custodes kind of low here, and certainly low for the sheer amount of people playing them, as they're the 5th most popular faction out of 28. Enormously efficient Sanguinary Guard and big punchy damage rules have got lots of people turning out for their Sons of Sanguinius and Force. As mentioned, their last balance changes had some pretty enormous points drops. Sanguinary Guard dropping down to 110 or 240 are pretty well auto-includes. Dante drops to 120, Jump Death Company, Mephiston, the Baal Predator, the Jump Captain and Vanguard Veteran veterans all went down, and Black Rage got a bit easier to deal with, though it still doesn't seem that people are using lots of Death Company. For the detachments, people are generally sticking with the Liberator Assault group. It looks like that's been having a little bit more success versus the Angelic Inheritors at the moment, both in terms of play rate and win rate. Aside from the basically auto-include Sanguinary Guard, they've got some fun fights first learn operatives in the Sanguinor and Mephiston. Captainers and Assault Intercessors can also punch hard for excellent value. Jump Intercessors are very nice skirmishing squads. Scouts are pretty great with combat blades, and they often tend to get backed up by a small amount of Space Marine firepower to hit the things that the melee units can't handle quite so well. Overall though, at least so far by the numbers, it looks like the buffs have got them more into the sort of upper mid-tier range as opposed to being one of the strongest armies in the game. Looks like there's an absolute ton of people that are placing fairly high and going say 4-1 with them, but very few taking them to the next level to the absolute tops of tournaments though. I guess it might be partly a case of melee damage only getting you quite so far, and some of their units are getting to the next level only when they're buffed by the stratagems from the detachment, which can't have their effects active on everything at once. Finally, for the armies that were tied on 50%, we've got the Adepta Sororitas. This is a battle placing 7th. Pre-update, very few people were choosing to play them, though they're still having an alright win rate for the few that did, and they have risen up from that up to 50% after a whole bunch of big points cuts. They still remain an army that not all that many people are choosing to put on the tabletop. Out of the 28 factions, they're only placing 20th, but that's still a fair bit higher than they were before, and they've done fairly impressively on the top tables for a small population like that, 4 people going 5 games undefeated, which is really quite solid for the numbers playing. Their last update had some solid points drops, loads of staples going down a bit, the Castigator, Immolator, Paragon, Seraphim and more, plus the really big change of the Champions of Faith no longer taxing miracles. And it does look like that's been enough to make it one of the stronger options, being played far more than it was before. It actually looks like it's a rival for the Hallowed Martyrs in terms of win rates and things now. It's still the Hallowed Martyrs that seems to have won the grand tournaments though, taking 3 tournament victories. Certainly feel like it's taken a fair few of the staples and made them stronger. The Castigator was already good and got better, as is the Immolator splitting some Battle Sister squads. Paragon Warsuits and Morven Val are still absolutely murderous. Celestian Sacrosancts were already really quite nice and enjoyed Champions of Faith. The Seraphim got more efficient, and plenty of really nice support characters as well, such as Fighty Palatines, and potentially lots of spammed characters in the Hallowed Martyrs. Being able to force the enemy to dump all the attacks into one unit or to revive characters on death are both really powerful stratagems. Overall doesn't seem to be too bad for the Sisters of Battle. They still don't really strike me as one of the easy armies to play. Fragile units having to do intelligent things with trading on objectives, plus making good use of their miracle dice reserves, and they might struggle to overcome the big toughness 11 multi-wound profiles of all those knights stomping around at the moment, but seems like they may be holding their own at least better than most. Starting to move up the win percentages now. Next up we have the Necrons. Looks like they're on 51% wins, roughly where they were prior to the balance updates. The more casual ones from Goonhammer are a bit lower. It looks like a solid enough amount of people are managing to take them all the way to the top. 6 players going 5 games undefeated in a row at the start of a tournament, and lots of excitement and interest to play the faction at the moment, being the 4th most played army at grand tournaments currently. The last balance changes maybe had the Necrons not come off so badly for an army that was already fairly strong. The Scorpet Lord and the Enagic Dermal Bond both went up, as did the individual Locusts. The Wraiths and the Technomancer got an unexpected buff they probably didn't really need all that much, and Death Marks, Illuminor Eras, the Doomstalker and the Plasmancer all went down. For the detachments being used the most, it still seems to be the rivalry between the Starshatter Arsenal and the Awakened Dynasty. Looks like the Starshatter Arsenal is doing better for win rates currently, both competitively and casually, exceeding Awakened Dynasty around about, say, 53% to 47%. There could be a bit of randomness between those though. Hypercrypt and Canoptech Court are both seeing some play and some success as well. The majority of the Necron Codex is at least somewhat usable at the moment. Wraiths with a Technomancer, as mentioned, feel like an absolute star of a unit, just super tanky and being able to reanimate in a really big way. The Silent King and Doomsday Arcs are very efficient, and more so in Starshatter. You can make these mini Silent King with the Catacomb Command Barge in that detachment as well. The Catan can be nice as strong centerpiece models, particularly the Nightbringer just for some enormous stats, even if he doesn't have too much move. They've got plenty of good options for cheap secondary grabbing and interference style units, things like flayed ones or Ophidian Destroyers burrowing on and off the board. Imatech can provide some command points if you want. The Canoptech Reanimator works well with both of their most played detachments for repeatedly reanimating tough stuff, and Scorpet Destroyers with a Scorpet Lord are particularly nice in Awakened Dynasty as well, with all the character and layered buffs they can get. Overall feels like Necrons maybe aren't in the worst place at the moment. Most of their units at least fairly usable, maybe a little sad that things like the Warriors and Immortals don't tend to crop up in all that many lists, Warriors only really start to get viable if you just stack a million synergies on them with Orokin the Diviner. You can certainly have a very big reanimating unit, but it might be nice to have them good in a way that doesn't need a million support pieces to do so. Definitely in a solid spot as 40k goes though. Next up, and placing in 5th at the moment, we've got the Leagues of Votann. They've got a 52% win rate, rising up +2 from where they were prior to the balance updates, and just seems like a lot of good players have had some good results with them early on, similar to the Necrons having 6 players go 5 games undefeated, though it doesn't really look like they stand out in terms of people choosing to put them on the board. 17th most played, and the more casual data from Goonhammer tells a bit of a different story, down at 48%, which to me feels a little bit more reflective of the faction's power. I must admit, I do suspect that ranking up here might be at least partly due to the leagues having a few good weeks at the start of this, and I really wouldn't be too surprised to see them drop down with another month or so's data, though I guess they do have some big hitting damage and defensive things that could be quite nice into things like Death Guard or Imperial or Chaos Knights. Getting +1 to hit and wound against tanky units, and then hitting them with big damage profiles does seem to be a good way to deal with them. The last balance change didn't really change much at all, with the Ironmaster and Grimnir's just having a bit more ease of access to transports. They're still using their Index Oathband attachment, given that the Grotmus one doesn't really see play, and then they remain basically in the same fairly strong spot as they were before. They still only have a small roster of units, though most of it really very playable. Sagitaurs with a mix of Hearthkin and Berserks tend to be at the heart of the army. Maybe something like a pair of Land Fortresses at 2,000 points, good for big focal stratagems. Lots of lists go heavy on the Hernkin Pioneers, and usually one unit of Jaegers to screen out the midboard and allow your scout moves to take effect. Brokir Thunderkin are nice enough with their grav cannons. Maybe in terms of units played a bit less, the Einherjar Hearthguard aren't seeing the tabletop quite as much as they used to be before, and the Votann characters tend to be in a bit more of a niche supporting role as opposed to a mainstay. For weaknesses and downsides, they tend to be a relatively straightforward damage and defense style 40k playstyle. Not quite as many sneaky tricks as some armies, though it seems to be working out for them well enough at the moment. The unit pool is limited, hopefully the codex might help with that with a few more releases. And as mentioned, my guess will be that their win rates will continue to fall a bit as we get more data, though I guess we'll wait and see there. Maybe they're just well suited to a target-rich environment for judgment tokens. Next up, on placing in 4th, we have the Chaos Knights. With the balance updates, they had their codex points go into effect, and they do seem to have risen up with that, gaining a +3% wins compared with where they were before with their War Dog spam, now often tending to stomp forward with a bunch of Titanic Knights. They do have less data than the most though, so maybe a little bit less certain. It's just over the last 2 weeks. Post-Codex, the more casual games from Goonhammer seem to be a bit next level though. They have them a more sort of 60% wins, which might fit with the general theme of Knights tending to do better in more casual metas or RTTs. So far, they've gone undefeated in the first 5 games in 5 tournaments so far, which is really quite impressive given that they've only had 2 weeks worth of play with the Codex. The competitive play rate is still a bit on the low side, but has been rising fast. The Codex update massively changed things for them, basically moving them from pure War Dog spam as the way to play the army for far too long, into having a lot more excitement for the big knights and multiple good detachments with which to do so. The biggest change was probably the points cuts to the big knights that took them all the way down to around about 335 points or so, and there's multiple great ones to choose from between the regular ones and Cerastus. Lords of Dread does seem to be the most standout winner on the competitive scene. The Infernal Lance does look like it's the other strong one, at least in my opinion. It was probably the one that I was most drawn to when taking a look at the Codex. Seems that someone managed to go a big 7-0 with that one at the Leeds Super Major, I think. It looks like basically all of them are doing at least alright. There's far less top table success for things that aren't the Lords of Dread or Infernal Lance. For standout units, there's a whole bunch of things to choose from. The Abominant, Rampager, and Despoiler are all excellent for Abhorrent Chassis Knights. The Lancer with its big melee damage and Atropos with anti-Titan style things are also very standout for the Cerastus. The Warlord Carnivore is absolutely excellent for its brutal melee damage, and the Stalker's usable with Scout. And if you want to add in some allied demons, then often some bases of Nurglings and some beasts of Nurgle for some small unit support could be exactly what they need for some cheap things to screen and do grunt work. Overall, looks like they're having a very good time at the moment. Maybe in terms of army issues, perhaps direct comparison to the Imperial Knights and what they get for their raw strength isn't the most favourable at the moment. The Codex definitely evened that up a bit more than it was before though. And as ever, Knights tend to be stronger at the more casual or RTT style level versus the top tables of grand tournaments, though obviously they absolutely seem to be doing fine in both here. Next up, and placing in 3rd for win rates at least, are the Pestilent Scions of the Death Guard. They look like they're on 54% tournament victories at the moment. Again, at more casual games meta with Goonhammer, that's out to 58. It does look like at Grand Tournaments they've dropped down a bit since the balance update, maybe having a bit more rivalry from Thousand Sons and Knights now. In terms of top table success though, they're pretty much the unquestioned victor there. Since the balance update, over the past 4 weeks, no less than 20 players appear to have gone the first 5 games undefeated, so an absolutely monstrous win record there. And for raw numbers about double the amount of any of their competitors. That's still a standout excessive number, even despite being the most played faction in competitive play at the moment. People having the most faith that Death Guard can have some big effect on the tabletop. Death Guard did feel like they got away with murder a little bit at the last balance update, quite clearly being one of the single strongest armies in the game, and with far less rivals before night updates, and not seeing any points increases that people are expecting at some point or another. They just had nurglings raised very slightly. For their strong options, they've got loads of good things to talk about. Their detachments do have some balance and interest. Virulent Vectorium, the general purpose play company, being the single most popular, with some stratagems and enhancements that work well for multiple things. They're the character focused champions of Contagion, with the big stratagems that gets, and Mortarian's Hammer for automatically marking some units for Afflicted, and a focus on Death Guard vehicles. Both of those are having some good success as well. For their most highly standout units, Death Shroud Terminators with a Lord of Contagion are kind of impossible to go wrong with. Enormously punchy melee units that can just drop 6 inches away and then hit you very, very hard. Plague Marines jumping out of Rhinos with character support and then shooting and charging will be able to take down absolutely alpha level threats in the enemy army. They're perhaps some of the best standout damage output if you can get them into a core important enemy unit. And then Bloat Drones with Blight Haulers again are in kind of auto include territory near enough at 100 points for that general purpose damage 3 profile, maybe having their firepower directed by Lord of Virulence. Regular Bloat Drones and Blight Haulers are also nice. Beyond that, there's plenty more though. Mortarion himself is pretty massive. The Demon Prince with a 5+ Feel No Pain in Virulent Vectorium. Typhus is still solid, and a Lone Tallyman is good for rustling up some command points, and some Poxwalkers can be nice and cheap to take the midboard. Overall, I feel like their single biggest issue at the moment is they're probably first in line alongside the Knights for an out-of-sequence balance update. It does seem that, at least for now, they don't have the single best win rate in the game, though the top tournament victories tell a different story. Clearly an army that can absolutely dominate at the highest level when played by a good player. Next up, and slightly higher than them, we have the Thousand Sons. Looks like Meta Monday has them at 55% wins, so rising up +4 there. Another army that seems to have gained rather massively from their codex recently. Kind of interesting that they seem to be doing quite a lot better on the competitive scene versus slightly more casual games. Goonhammer's win rates has them more like 50% or so. I feel like that's maybe not going too far out of keeping with their reputation though. Maybe an army that tends to get significantly better when fielding a complete meta list and played by someone who really knows how to use their options, which are quite big and varied, and putting in maximal thought versus more casual games maybe. For their top placings, it looks like they've had 10 tournaments with the first 5 games undefeated, and that looks like it's a pretty similar performance to Death Guard when he actually weights them for the number of players. They're 8th most played out of 28 factions, and that's seriously very high for them. Lots of people choosing to put some rubrics and sorcerers on the tabletop. The codex changes they got were really quite big. Loads of updated units and detachment rules. It seems that out of those it's still the slightly index style Grand Coven that is the single most popular and successful. Lots of good things for amplifying psychic damage and doing a bit of manipulation with the Kabbalistic rituals, plus some good enhancements. Beyond that, the Warp Meld Pact also seems to be doing kind of similarly well in terms of performance, but it's just played far less with people who are taking some Zangol armies. And the Rubrique Phalanx has definitely had a lot of interest, being quite a popular one focused on some of people's favourite units. It does genuinely have some huge damage and some big strength, but it does ultimately seem to be one that's getting lower win rates, more like 45% versus 55%, and seems to be more played in casual versus competitive. For their standout units, the Mutalith Vortex Beast has a lot of good damage and some seriously powerful shooting, and some nice buffs for nearby with your casting. Zangor Enlightened with the Great Bows are enormously efficient, moving fast and shooting far heavier than a skirmishing unit has any real right to. Upgrading to a full 6 of them is really tempting when they're just 16 points per model, and their shooting can be amplified by the Kabbalistic rituals in a big way. Rubric Marines are an absolute staple, usually with Warp Flamers and led by Sorcerers or the Infernal Master, often in Rhinos to jump out and boost their psychic damage. They've got lots of nice skirmisher units, regular Zangors for scout and redeploys, cheap skirmishing spawn that are quite tough with their invulnerable save, the regular Zangor Enlightened, and Sekitar robots as the niche infiltrator role. They maybe don't compare very favourably to other infiltrators though. Magnus is a solid centrepiece, more so in Grand Coven than elsewhere. The Demon Princes are pretty playable, and even the Scarab Occult Terminators and the Scarab Sorcerer are seeing competitive play, though in Rubrique Phalanx as opposed to elsewhere. The Predator Annihilator was maybe a slightly surprising winner of the Codex as well, some really quite serious anti-tank against a Psychic Marks unit. Overall, between all that, they have some enormously scary threats. Generally, Thousand Sons can absolutely have enough damage to blast whatever they can see off the tabletop, though maybe a little bit less flexibility with needing to get close or being able to coordinate multiple units with the chance of failure of casting, and maybe take a few big decisions as to making all of these schemes and sequence of events goes all according to Tzeentch's plans. Overall though, with an optimised list played well, it looks like they're in an absolutely great spot, probably in the sort of area, unfortunately for them, that they might well be attracting nerfs and points increases. It looks like they're well capable of fighting with Death Guard and Knights and doing well. Speaking of Knights once again though, and it looks like it's the Imperial Knights sitting at the top of the shop for the win rates. Looks like over the past 2 weeks worth of tournament data from Meta Monday since the big nightly update, they've had a 57% wins, and along with Death Guard they were already pretty much the most successful army in the game on that metric. The huge drop to Titanic Knight points cost having just boosted that even further so far. It looks like they're fairly similar to the Chaos Knights on the Goonhammer data at 60%, and maybe not too surprised to see that they're looking kind of oppressive at a casual level. For their tournament successes, they've had a lot, far more than normal for Knight armies, and 10 players have managed that despite only having their buff rules for 2 weeks. They were already having some good success beforehand though. It looks like in terms of play rate right now, they're second only to the Death Guard in terms of people putting them on the table, presumably due to just being a very easy to access way to field an incredibly strong army in game. Their latest balance changes were to get their stat lines to match the Chaos Knights, lower toughness and higher wounds, and armor just getting shorter range melters, but then also going hand in hand with absolutely huge points decreases to the Titanic Knight options, which already weren't really all that bad for the Imperials. Players are still using the Noble Lance, and rather than going for the Canis and Armiger spam that tended to be the way before, it's now generally going for 3 to 5 big knights, plus Armigers and likely some agents, the Calidus Assassin still being particularly stand out there for doing secondary objectives. For the nightly variants, I've seen very few people not choosing to run Canis Rex. At 380 points, he's got to be in the running for the single most undercosted model in 40k, or at least one of the ones that you'll feel the most. And then he's got loads of efficient choices for backup. Lancers and the Knight Atropos are both excellent with their damage profiles, invulnerable saves in melee, 28 wounds and 365 point costs. Crusaders and Castellans feel like they're fairly standout as well, though most of the other Questoris lineup is easily usable enough. Armigers are still solid units, and plenty of people are still going at least fairly heavy, maybe the balance being slightly more tipped towards Helverins after the Warglaves got a nerf. They do tend to be in a slightly more supporting role as opposed to the absolute focus of the army though. Overall does look like Imperial Knights have the raw army strength and firepower to take on the vast majority of foes in the game. They're certainly not unbeatable by every army though, they're still only on a 57%. So at least 4 out of every 10 games people are managing to win against Knights. Armies like Death Guard and Thousand Sons likely have enough damage output if they can catch them to hit them hard. And as per normal, if you can overcome the stat check, they don't have quite as many sneaky tricks to fall back on. It might be possible to stall and outscore them. At the strength level at the moment though, they've got to be one of the most intimidating factions to beat in the game when played well by a good player. I guess we'll see what happens when the Codex turns up when it eventually gets there. Maybe the decreased points might look a bit more sensible if they nerf the core faction rule in some sort of big way. I certainly guess that Canis Rex won't have a crazy amount of time as being the single strongest model of 40k. It's just a bit too obvious for a nerf. And it's certainly possible they could be addressed in an emergency balance patch if Games Workshop decides to run one. At the moment though, looks like Knights are having a bit of a power trip in Warhammer 40k. Finally, let's round up with a few overall summaries. In terms of top tournament success, with 5 games undefeated in a row, these are the rankings. Death Guard just massively dominating versus the competition so far here. Imperial Knights, Thousand Sons and World Eaters next. And as mentioned, a few other armies joining the top 10 for top of tournament placings. The World Eaters, Tyranids and Space Marines notable amongst them. It's also maybe slightly noticeable as well that some of the ones that are there, like the Blood Angels and Adeptus Custodes, which seem to be off the rankings a bit, though a few good players doing well could change that in a big way. To really fine-tune the top tournament success, I think it's also interesting to see those numbers weighted by the amount of people playing the faction, as obviously a faction that gets played more is going to have highest wins. Even accounting for that though, the Sons of Mortarion seem to come out smiling. It looks like it's them tied with the Black Templars for the top spots, interestingly enough. The ones that are marked in red here do have kind of noticeably lower data than the others, so there's going to be a far bigger amount of randomness, and a couple of Black Templar players who have done very well just get outsized results due to so few people playing the faction right now. Thousand Sons are basically at the same sort of level as Death Guard though in terms of chance to win big, and World Eaters really not far behind. Then leagues of Votann, Sisters, Genestealer Cults, Knights, Demons and more Knights come next. The Tyranids and Space Marines maybe being a little bit less standout on this list just due to how many people are playing them. Speaking of which, here's the play rate at grand tournaments, the factions that people are choosing to put on the tabletop, reflecting a good amount of what they think will do well, but also just which factions are most popular as well. Death Guard and Imperial Knights seem to be winning. I guess Imperial Knights already being fairly solidly strong beforehand and then getting massively more popular with the buffs. People are enjoying putting Tyranids and Necrons on the tabletop, and Space Marines are always popular as well. Thousand Sons and World Eaters are definitely notable to see this high up as well, people enjoying their new codexes. Finally, here's the Grand Tournament win rates once again. So overall, the top 5 being Imperial Knights, Thousand Sons, Death Guard, Chaos Knights, and Leagues of Votann, though really quite a lot not so very far behind. In any case, let me know your thoughts on them down in the comments below. Which armies would you rate as the strongest right now? That's it for this one, though I'll just cycle back to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold to talk a little bit more about their magnetic carry cases. In their mag case boxes, they have trays of various different levels, and each tray has this rough capacity. You can fit around about 90 25mm bases on it, about 30 odd Terminators or 6 Armigers if you load them super tight. And then for transport, there's different mag cases for different heights and shapes depending on what you want to transport into battle. With their sale on at the moment, the smallest one is this mini. It's £66 or $75. That includes any shipping, but there might be VAT or sales tax on top of that, and they come with some magnets included. Then there's the regular mag case. This one's £105 or $120. This one's a fair bit taller and is a bit more normal size for transporting a regular army into battle. As you can see by the big Chaos Knight standing on the ground floor there, it's a fairly spacious one. I'll put the internal dimensions on screen. And then finally there's the absolutely enormous one with the XL version. That one's basically 2 of the previous attached together for double the storage. And there's different options that you can get depending on how many metal sheets that you want, which can affect the price a bit. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. You can find them linked down in the video description. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and hopefully later in the week I'll do a similar one looking at the other end of the meta. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.